Hi, I'm Dr. Lenore Walker, and welcome to my podcast, Beyond Abuse. Today, I'm going to talk about identifying domestic violence in a relationship. In this section, we're going to talk about how do you know if you or someone you know is in a domestic violence relationship. Well, in order to know that, we need to know how do we define domestic violence. Most people define it as physical, sexual, and or psychological abuse. It doesn't have to be all of them, but it can be any one of them or a combination of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse that occurs in an intimate relationship. Again, it doesn't have to be married. Intimate means to have some kind of either living together or having lived together or having sex together or some other form of intimacy that makes it a special relationship, different from just a friend or a neighbor down the block. And that person in an intimate relationship with you is coercing you to do something you don't want to do without regard for your rights. So again, it's any kind of physical, it could be just a tap, a touch, a push, a shove, hair pulling, or more serious punches and kicks and choking and that kind of abuse, or holding weapons on you, threatening you with a weapon or a knife or a gun or whatever. So that's the definition of a domestic violence relationship. It's pretty broad, as you can tell. There are certain kinds of things about it, though, that really help us define whether it's domestic violence or not. One of which is that whole notion about power and control. The batterer or the abuser, be it male or female, although most of the work we know about domestic violence relationships are about males to females. But the batterer, and I use that term loosely, or the abuser, takes power away from you or from the person who's being abused. They have to be in control all the time. And the kind of control we call coercive control. It's a term that's used to denote the fact that this person is forcing you to do something. And it's using threats, intimidation, some time not even having to say it verbally, but just the look in their face tells you, you better do it, or you could be hurt. Coercive control is an interesting phrase that's now actually used in some, as against the law in some places, especially in family law. We see a lot of coercive control where one partner tries to force the other partner into doing all kinds of things, and often involving the children. Coercive control, it's a term that was originally developed by a psychologist named Evan Stark, and there are a number of books that are written about it, and we talk about it in our Survivor Therapy Empowerment Program, or our STEP program. Another definition that's important to understand in domestic violence relationship is the term gaslighting. It's an interesting term that comes actually from a movie back in the late 1940s where a person, in this case we're going to call it the abuser, tries to make the other person think that they're crazy. It's kind of called gaslight them. For example, you put your keys down when you come into the house. You always put it down in a particular spot on a table. And you go to look for your keys, and they're not there. And you say to your partner, "Oh, did you see my keys?" Very puzzled because you usually put it there. And then the partner says, "No, I didn't see them. You must have left them in the car." And you say, "Oh, I don't think so. but 10 minutes later you go back and look for your keys again and they're there. So the partner is saying, you say to the partner, did you put them there? And your partner says to you, no, I don't know what you're talking about. They've been there all the time. That's a kind of example of how somebody tries to really make you think like you're losing your mind. If a partner does that often enough, you really do feel like you're going crazy. So gaslighting is another term that we use to describe some of that kind of behavior that may go on in a domestic violence relationship. Another term that we use for definition is called love bombing. I called it in my work, as you'll see when we talk about the domestic violence cycle, I called it loving behavior, or loving contrition. I'm sorry and I love you and it'll never happen again kind of behavior. But love bombing also is really doing something to make you feel like you are so loved by this person. But 2 minutes later they take it back, or they don't really follow through on what they promised to do. Now, that's important because people would not stay with somebody who's negative and harms them all the time. And domestic violence does not happen all the time in these relationships. It happens at different times. And part of what we do in treatment is we try to help our patients define when it's happening so that they don't get sucked into it. In this section, we're going to talk about the fact that domestic violence does not happen all the time in a relationship. But in many of the relationships that we have studied, it happens in a cycle. We call it the abuse cycle or the cycle of violence. Sometimes it's portrayed as a circle, and sometimes I portray it as on a graph where we have several different periods. The first period lasts usually the longest period of time, and that's what we call the tension building period. Now, that doesn't happen until after courtship. So if really the courtship period could be considered the very first or the pre-abuse cycle, because you don't usually see abuse in the courtship period. That's usually a time that's filled with love, with a lot of talking and asking you things like, talk to me about your childhood. What do you love the most? I mean, he's learning all about you. And most women love to talk about ourselves, of course. And in any new relationship, we want to give the other person some idea of who we are. In these relationships, it's so intense. He's listening so carefully and he's taking it all down because he'll often use it afterwards in the cycle when the cycle begins. So after the courtship period, we have the first period of tension building where little things happen and he gets upset. Or he tries to make you do something, use a little coercive control, and you don't agree. I like to use the example of cooking dinner because it's so classic in domestic violence relationships, where you let's say you're the one who's being abused, so you notice that he's getting a little edgy, he's not feeling so good, things are happening that aren't going well for him, and so you try to be nice to him. You cook him a really nice dinner. You know that he loves spaghetti and meatballs, and so you make him delicious dinner, spend all afternoon cooking and getting it just right, set the table, put a pretty tablecloth on, put candlesticks out, light the candlesticks, everything, is set. The house looks perfect. He walks in and he's looking for a fight, and you just know it. He's kind of, anything you say, he gives you a kind of a nasty answer to, and you say, oh, come on, honey, I made you a nice dinner. Let's sit down and have just the two of us have a nice, quiet dinner, which is good for him because he's very possessive and he wants you to himself. And so he sits down and he puts his fork to the plate, and the meatball is very hot, and he burns his tongue, and he becomes enraged. Instead of, like most normal people would yell or say, oh, I hurt my tongue or something, he explodes. It's like, the tension just goes up so high, and he takes the plate of food and says, you call this whatever food, and throws it across the room and makes a mess. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody did that to me after I spent all that time trying to make it nice, I would say, go to your room. I would not, or I would walk out. But I'm not a battered woman. A battered woman would never do that, because if they did, they would pay for it later. They would know they would get hurt worse. So if they did it, they knew this was going to happen later. Instead, she quiets down, he leaves, and she cleans up the mess. If it were me, I would have had him cleaning it up. But again, I'm not a battered woman. And that's what we have to understand, that in a domestic violence relationship, you don't want to make it worse. You're going to do whatever you can to just calm it down. That's the explosive period, when he throws it and screams and yells. And he doesn't hit her, he just threatens and walks out. If things calm down, it could enter into the third phase, where he comes back and says, oh, I'm so sorry. But usually that doesn't happen right away. With a batterer, it takes him a longer time to calm down. And if he's in batterer's treatment, he may have learned how to do that. And that means you take a walk, but not only do you have to take a walk, but you also have to think about nice things. You can't think about what just happened. Now, sometimes if there has been physical abuse, he didn't just throw the food, but he also starts beating her up. At that point, that may be sufficient to call the police. Then you've got a criminal act. And we'll talk more about that later on. But that's the cycle. He may come back a couple of days later. He may disappear for a few days and come back and say, I'm sorry. Or if he's actually hurt her badly, he often will come back. When he knows he's gone too far, that's when he'll stop. But until then, you can get very badly hurt in these relationships. And so battered women learn how to protect themselves. They're very good at being able to do that. So that's the cycle. And it may last the positive part. Maybe there's no loving part anymore if it's a long-time relationship. Maybe there's just no violence whatsoever. But we'll see if we can look at some graphs of that so you can see the different cycles that can occur. And it may take some time before it occurs again. There may be some very positive parts, and that's what keeps women in the relationship. This third phase, the positive parts of the relationship. But it does start again, inevitably, if it's a domestic violence relationship, and the cycle begins all over again. Sometimes it stays at about the same level. Sometimes, in most relationships, it increases a little bit each time until, if there hasn't been physical abuse, until it may get to it, or maybe it doesn't need this physical abuse to keep you obeying him and doing what he demands. Sometimes it's sexual abuse, but always there's psychological abuse with it. Put downs, name calling, telling you never do anything right, kinds of exaggerations. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about the legal system. which we have worked for many years, at least 50 years that I've been around, in trying to make sure that abuse towards women in the relationship can be considered a criminal behavior. Interesting story. Way back in the early 1980s, we had somebody in the domestic violence office of the U.S. government named Lois Harrington who decided that she would try to take testimony from victims of violence and to try to figure out how her office on victims could be helpful to them. So she set up hearings across the United States in different places. I was in Denver, Colorado at the time, and I thought I was working with a group of other domestic violence advocates, and we thought that she should be asking for domestic violence victims to also testify in these hearings that she was setting up. But she said no, she only wanted to deal with victims of other kinds of violence and accidents and things like that. So we decided in Denver, we would take that kind of testimony. We had originally talked to the first place where Harrington's testimony was going to be, which was in Boston, and the domestic violence advocates there told us that their attempts to get domestic violence people to testify did not go well. And so we decided we would set up our own hearings and not interfere with Harrington's hearings. So we asked our state governor to let us use the old courtroom in the Capitol building on the same exact day. And so while in the courthouse they were taking the testimony with Harrington's commission, we were taking testimony, we being our advocate group, of domestic violence victims. Lois Harrington got word of what was happening. She stopped her group and she came over to us and said, "Oh my goodness, you made your point. I guess we will start doing that, and we will have a second commission that we will fund, and we will take testimony across the country only from domestic violence victims." And so she did that. And the end was Congress, she recommended, her committee recommended to Congress that they give states the opportunity, because it is state by state, but encourage them in whatever ways they could to pass laws that domestic violence was against the law and to prosecute them just like you would prosecute any other kind of crime. So I like to tell that story because it wasn't always that we could get police to make the arrests and get prosecutors to push the cases forward, or to have judges even listen and issue penalties, appropriate penalties for the type of abuse that is used against women. Mostly women by men, sometimes also men by men. Occasionally, we came across women who were abusing men. About 5% of the cases that we looked at across the United States and then around the world, which was pretty similar in different countries and different places for the kinds of arrests that were being made. At some point, they were mutual arrests being made if a woman fought back, and so we had to deal with the fact that women should be allowed to defend themselves if nobody else was there to help them. And we also tried to get the barriers to agencies and institutions to help deal with domestic violence victims to provide services for them. So domestic violence wasn't always considered a crime, and the legal system still has some problems with it. The best systems have a victim advocate who works with the domestic violence victim so she feels safe in being able to come forward and testify. We also have trained police to be able to document what they find when they get to answer a domestic violence call so that the evidence is there in the police report and the police officer can testify even if the victim doesn't want to testify. And we had to find ways of being able to serve the papers to a domestic violence abuser who would often run away and hide. And so we got laws passed to be able to do what we call constructive service of a subpoena to appear in court. And we published it in the paper. And that was suffice the kind of publication that you need. And if he doesn't answer, he still is held responsible for coming to court and defending himself. So it's been an interesting battle over the last 50 years. Today, some places do it better than others. Some police officers are better than others in terms of documenting and protecting women, not just taking the man out and saying, behave yourself, or some other take a walk around the block kind of attempt that doesn't really protect women when the crimes are very serious. And abuse still exists, but we hope that there are more avenues of support within our society for battered women. This section, we're going to be talking about whether or not all battered women are the same. Of course not. Each woman has her own personality and her own life situation. So the abuse that occurs may well be different. The same for the abuser. He may have his own issues. And so the abuse sometimes follows a cycle that we talked about earlier, but sometimes is very different. Let's take a couple of cases so that you get an illustration of what I'm trying to say here. For example, let's take a story of abuse with Beverly Eben Tomas. We can use her real name because this is a woman whose case was actually in the appellate legal issues. In that case, she was being physically abused while she was pregnant. The abuse was not that serious in terms of needing hospitalization, but it terrified her. And her abusive husband had a lot of power in the community in which they lived, which frightened her even more. In other cases, we have very severe physical abuse. For example, let's call her Helen. This woman was moved from a city, an urban area where she had a lot of friends and family, to a very small rural area where nobody could really get to her or know what was happening. And isolation is one of the techniques that batterers use in order to keep control over women. We have a lot of women that are abused. They're battered women, but they don't always put a label on it because there is no physical abuse. Sometimes there's sexual abuse, but they don't talk about that very much. For example, we had one woman who was having a depressive episode. She had lost the ability to contact her children, and her abuser was a boyfriend who she didn't live with, but spent a lot of time with. However, each time they would go out, it had to be to some place where she couldn't be seen. So with him. And so she felt like she was a second-class citizen and was really abused by this. Another two cases I want to talk about to give you an example of how much money you have really doesn't matter. The abuse can be almost identical. For example, let's take the cases of Heather and of Jane. Jane was a woman who did not have a lot of money, nor did her abuser. But right up front where they met, she was going to the hairdresser, and he came in and changed the color of her hair, coercing her to do that and to actually make the hairdresser follow his idea. He also went into her closet and he ripped up dresses that he didn't like her wearing, and he bought her very sexy kinds of dresses and flirtatious dresses, and then would beat her up if somebody looked at her funny. But he would dress her so that she would be attracted to a certain kind of guy who would look at her that way. That's a lot of control over her life. And yet there was not a lot of money involved. Take Heather, who actually was dating and then moved in and lived with a very wealthy man. This man didn't like her clothes either, but what he did was take her to Paris, and she could get clothes from Chanel and from Dior and from other designers. She began to like that lifestyle. They would go on trips in his private plane, but he told her where to live. He then moved her into his house, and he actually had several houses, and she could move to one house or another depending on where he wanted to be. So her entire life became controlled by him and what he wanted. This is what we mean by coercive control. She was not physically abused until the end of that relationship, but she was sexually abused during it. And we find that many women who say, I'm not being physically abused, therefore I can't be battered, when they're coerced into having sex, even when they don't want it, they believe they have no choice because sex is part of a relationship, and so they have to give in. And again, this is part of coercive control and part of domestic violence. So coercive control is an interesting phenomenon. It's a name that we give to what I, in my very beginning of my work, called abuse of power and control. But the name coercive control was suggested by another mental health clinician named Evan Stark, and it sort of took over. And so we talk about it because it really shows how it doesn't have to be physical, and it doesn't even have to be sexual abuse that can cause a woman to allow that man to control her because she gets something for it. It's a kind of quid pro quo, if you will, employment litigation when people have sexual harassment charges. But what they don't realize is that you might be getting something at the moment, but in the long run, you lose control over your whole life. They get the control. I called it, using the theory of learned helplessness, way back in the 1970s when I read some of the work of a psychologist named Martin Seligman, who did some experiments with dogs and showed how if you gave them intermittent reinforcement, these are psychology terms, and I'll define them a little bit more for you, which really means that sometimes they would be given something that was really very nice and they liked, and other times they would be electrocuted and they were on electrical grids in cages. He did a lot of work with different animals, but dogs were particularly the ones I was impressed with because the dogs would be zapped with electricity at random and variable times. That meant they couldn't tell whether they were going to get something nice or they were going to get something mean and painful. And those kinds of shocks couldn't be done today, of course, but we learned something from them, even though way back when in those days. And what happened was that these dogs that were normal, active dogs would go from one side of the cage where there was electric grids to the other side of the cage when they would open up the doorway to let them go in the beginning. But as they would get more and more shocks at different random times, they stopped going out into the other side where they could escape the shock, and rather they lied down on those electrical grids. What we discovered was that they would defecate on those electrical grids, and that would cause the shocks to be less painful. The conclusion was that they learned not to be helpless, but they learned not to think that what they did would allow them to escape. Seligman named it learned helplessness. It was probably a bad name for it, but it was a good theory because what they were saying was that you could do what battered women do, which is they begin to accommodate to what the abuser is doing. They try to keep him calm. They try to make it less painful, but they don't escape. They learn that they can't escape from these relationships. Now, I did my early research on that, and what I found out was that it was accurate. Escaping from a batterer is almost impossible. It's very difficult to do. He will find them, and he doesn't let them go. So even though everybody likes to say, why don't you leave? The truth is, leaving doesn't stop the violence. He will continue to obsessively find her and woo her back with the positive things that were in the relationship. We call it a loss of contingency between your actions and the outcome. But you don't need the fancy psychological language to understand that if you can be wooed back into a relationship or to try again, because battering relationships are not all bad. There's a lot of positive things, just like Heather, who had living a different kind of lifestyle with her rich boyfriend at the time. That was exciting. And the abuse doesn't happen all the time. And so people really believe batterers when they say, okay, I'm not going to do it again. And they're safer when it's an oxymoron, but they really are safer to stay in the relationship. I stopped using learned helplessness in some of my writings, although I still used it when I testified in cases because it made so much sense to jurors who understood that the woman would have some reasons to stay, just as she would have some reasons to leave an abusive relationship. That didn't define what they were leaving. And I suggest, as we're talking today, that it does define the woman in the end, that those benefits that she's getting in the beginning slowly become eroded and the relationship becomes much less beneficial for her to stay in it. So what can we do? How can we help battered women? If you are a battered woman, how can you help yourself? Or how can we, as part of society, help you? Or if you know a battered woman, what can she do? What can you do to help her do what she needs to do? Leaving is not always the goal. The goal should always be violence-free. Every one of us has the right to live a violence-free life. We don't have to be in a relationship where there is abuse or violence. And so let me give you a couple of tips. If you know somebody, the best thing you can do is be her friend. Listen to her. Don't judge her, but help her see what's really happening. Don't participate in hiding it, because that's what many battered women think they're doing. Of course, after they get out, they learn that their friends all knew what was happening, but many of them never said it to her. Either they felt like they didn't have the right to do it, or they said it to her too many times and they got tired of telling her to get out. But getting out does not stop the violence. Remember that. So the goal should always be help her be able to stop being abused, to take back her power in the relationship. Now, what if it's you? What if you are listening to this and you're saying, oh my, I kind of recognize that my relationship, I don't feel like I have power. I feel like I'm under coercive control. He tells me what to do all the time and I don't even think for myself anymore. Well, if it gets to that point, then maybe you need to seek out some of the resources we have in communities today. There are domestic violence shelters. Now, you don't have to go into a shelter in order to get help. For many shelters have outpatient groups, and it helps to talk to other battered women, to learn that you're not alone and that getting out is possible and possible to do safely. Remember, the most dangerous time in a domestic violence relationship is when the woman decides to leave. That is the time when she's most likely to be hurt worse. The abuse escalates because he's trying to keep her there, or she gets killed. And it's much more likely for a woman to be killed than for the woman to kill the abuser. So we don't want that to happen. We want people to get out and to really be violence-free. So seek help from the Battered Women Task Forces or groups. Sometimes you can call prosecutors' offices in the courthouse, in the criminal justice system. If you're ready to leave, or the woman is ready to leave, then she ought to get a restraining order. Now, people say, well, a restraining order is just a piece of paper. That's true, but it's a piece of paper that says to the whole criminal justice system, I'm ready to be safe, and I need your help to keep me safe. So if the police are called and they see that you have a restraining order, they will help you much more likely than if they don't see that. So that's one of the things I suggest to women that they get. Also, I suggest keep a recording, whether it's on a computer, it's in your cell phone, or it's just on a notepad someplace that you keep private, of all the incidents that happen. Many battered women say, well, what does it pay to write it down? Nobody's going to believe me anyhow. The truth is, when you have a record and show the pattern of abuse, you can get help much more easily. So I say keep a record of every abusive incident, whether or not you can prove it. We want your thoughts about it and what you think is happening, because that affects your state of mind. It affects how you make decisions. So seek psychotherapy from a trained psychotherapist. In another podcast, I'm going to give a whole new way of looking at domestic violence trauma and how to heal from that kind of trauma. In fact, we're going to have a few more podcasts on trauma coming up. So you need to find a trauma-trained psychotherapist, whether they're a psychologist or a social worker or a psychiatric nurse or some other profession, counselor. If they've had trauma training, they will be able to help, more likely be able to help. And you need to be able to talk about it. Let other people know what's happening. Don't keep it secret. So what we'll try to do in our next podcast, we'll try to help women get out of battering relationships in a safe way. But for today, I want to close this podcast by helping you understand that being abused is not your fault, that you should not feel guilty about what's happened to you. Staying too long is what all of us do in different kinds of relationships. Think about working in some office where you shouldn't have been, or some other kind of work that you knew wasn't right for you, but you stayed because you needed the money or for some other benefits. So accept what it is and try to say, okay, I'm getting ready to move on. You won't want to get into marital therapy with a batterer because that can escalate the abuse. You want to get stronger yourself, but remember, as you get stronger, he may react negatively. So you have to protect yourself as you move forward with your life. But it's your life, and you need to be able to live it in a violence-free manner, in a way that feels good for you and for your kids, if you have children. And that's for another podcast, is for what to do with children. I want to leave you with this thought. We're dropping this podcast on Valentine's Day because sometimes the most important thing is learning what love is not. Thank you, listeners. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you'd like to hear. And thanks to my team who made this podcast possible. Stay tuned for our next podcast and find me everywhere as Dr. Lenore Walker.